Okay. This is us finishing up chapter 9. We're on verse 30. We are coming out of the transfiguration scene, and I talked about how transfiguration is the high point, kind of thematically answering that question of like, who is Jesus? Theme is starting to change to this mystery about what does it mean to rise from the dead? What does it mean that the Son of Man must die? The disciples struggling with that, uh, and Jesus coming down the mountain. And we're gonna get kind of not Jesus's last teaching, but Jesus's last like there's really only two. We had this earlier in Mark where there was a section where it just kind of like threw a bunch of parables all at it. At the end of this chapter, there's going to be a section where seemingly there's just a bunch of like quick sayings of Jesus kind of all thrown at it. I think they all have a thematic element that will kind of tie it or that we'll talk about a little bit later. Um, but one of the things I actually have nice things to say about the Enduring Word commentary today. One is that he has like an overall section header for the second half of the chapter, which is on to Jerusalem, which is very accurate, and I think is a thing that we should pay attention to. And if you don't regularly know the geography of the area, you won't get that that's what Jesus is now doing. He's now come down from the mountain and he's heading south, and he'll be heading now towards Jerusalem. For most of the beginning portion of Mark, he's hanging around the northern part. He goes to the outer edges and all of this stuff. But now he's very directly going to Jerusalem. And I don't think that that's a coincidence that that's after the transfiguration incident, right? It's like transfiguration happens, comes down from the mountain, goes to Jerusalem, right? He's making this path. And then this is all the stuff that kind of starts to happen while along the way. Okay.
They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him.
Okay, so again, they're confused, right? And it seems like a very simple thing. He's going to die, he's going to rise again. Why would they be confused about that? Because that's not a thing that occurs. So whenever you hear all these atheists that kind of make this point about like, oh, people don't rise from the dead, that's a stupid thing to believe. Yes, the disciples are right on board with you, like for that point. You are not breaking any new ground to state that people don't rise from the dead. Like, yes, that is generally true, and the disciples agree with you on that point. The Gospels agree with you. You're not breaking any like you're not coming up with something super new that no one's thought of. I wanted to show this kind of a map, right? So you have the Sea of Galilee, and then you have Galilee proper. They're passing through the region of Galilee, and they're going to go to Capernaum, which is at the top of the Sea of Galilee, which tells us what about the location of the mountain that they were on? It's above that, right? Or like it has to be somewhere, right? Well, there are no mountains over here, and there are no mountains over here. There are only mountains up here, and then there are mountains down here. So, right, so you get into arguments about where like the transfiguration occurs exactly, because it just says a mountain, doesn't really specify it clearly. But if you're paying attention to the story, Well, he comes down from the mountain. He passes through the region of Galilee, through to Capernaum, and then he's going to go down eventually to Jericho, which Jericho is down here, and then he's going to get to Jerusalem. And so it's very clear that in Mark, the location of the mountain of the Transfiguration is north of Galilee, right here. That puts it, if you are looking at this mountain, in the foothills of what is known as Mount Hermon. So the reason why I'm stating this is because this is one of Dr. Michael Heiser's whole point. He has a whole book that's called Reversing Hermon. That's all about how partially like what's going on there is Jesus kind of making this declaration, and that the Transfiguration is happening at the foot of Mount Hermon, where traditionally Mount Hermon is supposed to be like, it's kind of like you have to read the book like to get what he's talking about, but it's traditionally thought of, and it was a religious site for other competing religions, and so by the Jews of the Second Temple, it would have been thought of as the place where forces, or the supernatural forces of evil, like dwelled and lived. They lived up in like Mount Hermon, and that's because, right, like you go super far north of Israel, that's where like Samaria is. That's where the Samaritans live, and that's like the rival, like religious order to the Jews, right? And so it's a quick synopsis of what's going on there. Okay. Okay. This leads into the next part.
And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?"
Okay, so I just want to briefly note that, and we had this again, this reference to he was in the house, right? Just the house, as in like the house where he kind of like was having his main base. We've talked about that in the past. It was in Capernaum. They're not in Capernaum. Okay.
But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me."
Okay. So they have this whole thing about they're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. So I want to pitch this question to, I guess, the two of you here.
LeBron.
Why were they discussing not which is the greatest, but why were they discussing which one of them is the greatest?
I could pretend to sit here and think for a good 30 seconds.
Sure.
But I'm not gonna. You can try.
Sure.
I'm sure it was because the Sons of Thunder got to witness the Transfiguration and
I thought that they were the greatest.
so that they were pretty cool.
Okay.
It's surprising that I've never even considered why.
So one of like
Meanwhile, the other ones couldn't.
we've talked about like a number of like my like bugaboos with how like modern preachers like handle stuff in the Bible, and one of them is that just the disciples are always stupid, right? And we kind of talked about this a little bit last time. It's just like everybody's like, oh, the disciples are always stupid, and I would posit to you that maybe the disciples are not stupid, right? They're not super smart. They don't always do everything right. They sometimes interpret things right. They're not educated, right? They're not formally educated, but they're not dumb, right? Last time we talked about that, they asked a pretty clever question about like, why must Elijah come? I think the hint for why they were arguing about which one of them the greatest comes from the fact that it's connected to what were you discussing on the way? Well, what were they talking about on the way? Well, on the way, right? As they went through Galilee, he was teaching his disciples, the Son of Man is going to be delivered to the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. And they did not understand what he was saying. So maybe what they were doing is, as they were thinking and contemplating what it meant for the Son of Man to rise, it brought about this further question of which one of them is the greatest. Why would that be the case? Because, as we discussed before, they were probably thinking of it along the lines of, oh, after he dies or leaves or something, one of us is going to take over what he's doing and take his place. And it should probably be that the greatest of us is the one that does that, right? Like, that makes sense as to what everything, as to how they would have been thinking, I presume, right? Which is also partially why Jesus answers them. And this answer is going to actually be the theme for kind of the rest of the chapter and the rest of the thing that he says to them, because really the rest of the chapter could be thought of as explaining what Jesus's system is, right? How Jesus has this upside down system, how Jesus has this system that is contrary to how the systems of men work. And really, he's going to end up talking about that for like the next few chapters. And so, if anyone will be first, he must be last, and last of all, and servant of all. Okay. So I want to make this point, which this is a quote that I got from the dude's commentary, which again, I think, like I said, two good things.
The Duke's commentary?
Yes, but it's somebody else's quote. He usually puts he puts down the Vic Lebowski, yeah. It was not that, so with this upside down structure, right? It's important to get this. It was not that Jesus abolished ambition, right? So I've talked about that before, of like Jesus didn't just like get rid of desire, right? Like kind of like a Buddha system. He did not just abolish ambition. Rather, he recreated and sublimated ambition. For the ambition to rule, he substituted the ambition to serve. For the ambition to have things done for us, he substituted the ambition to do things for others. And so I actually think that this is a very clever point, and it's one of the points for why I make the argument that I actually think that America as a concept and as a country is kind of the culmination of the Christian vision. And part of the reason why is because our system of government fundamentally really understands power and ambition better than basically any other system that has come before it. It's obviously not perfect and has flaws, but of all other systems that come before it, it has a really good system. And what it's doing is that really that's why we have our separation of powers, right? We have the separation of powers, and we make the body that actually is the strongest is a collection, right? The Senate is actually the strongest body in governance, not the single unit. And the whole reason for that is because if you have an ordered system, right, which is what Jesus is combating against, like in the text, right, a strict hierarchy, that strict hierarchy inevitably comes back down and oppresses the people. And so, but because there will always be people vying for positions of power, what you do is you create a system where the people at the top are fundamentally not able to unify. You want the people at the top to constantly be checking each other's power. And so and part of the reason why they have 3 is because anytime where we have 3 main branches of government is because anytime where you have 2, right? Famously, the historic example would be like Rome. Once there's 2, you just need 1 to defeat the other, and then like you're golden. But if you have 3, you have kind of a triangle effect of if one gets too big, the other 2 are able to unite together to take them down. But also, you don't have even those individual bodies, you have them separated and not instantiated in one person, like the Roman triumvirate kind of a thing, because then you end up having the same issues, right? Right. So there's a whole bunch of theories that go into that, but I'm just trying to make the point of the understanding of these power dynamics is a fundamentally Christian notion that Christians have been aware of a long time. And I think America is a practical example of that playing out. Okay. I don't have a good answer to this next question. So we can spitball on this one for a second. What does it mean to receive someone? Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me.
Well, it says he took a child and put him in the midst of them.
Right.
So is to receive to put in the midst of
you?
That's also the words of
Possibly.
Mark, which may in turn be the wording of Peter. You know.
Yeah, sure.
It might be good to start with what it's not. So it's, if you put in its logical opposite, say
like rejecting people. Yeah.
To receive would be the opposite of rejecting.
Mhm.
Now that makes it broad, very, very broad in what it can actually mean for receiving a child.
Mhm.
But at the very least, it means that you are not rejecting them and pushing them away from you.
Yes. And I think, and which is literally going to be a story a little bit later.
Right.
I think in a couple chapters in Mark where children comes up and they start to push them away,
Right.
and he's like, no, let them come forward. I think it's also the case that it's connected to the idea of being a servant of all, right? And that, like, when a child comes to you, right, they're probably asking for something. And right, the idea I think would be that you serve them, right? And so you don't just say, well, I'm not going to serve them because they are beneath me or whatever, right? It's connected to the idea of serving. And so I really, and I think that the child aspect of it is showing the status aspect of the bottom of the hierarchy, right? The child would be all the way at the bottom. So it's like, so even serve a child, right? Where normally children, like, you just ignore them. They are somebody else's property or whatever, right? And it's like, no, you serve even the children. That, yeah, I think that's probably that's basically the best that I came up with. I think that works too.
And I feel like it's to interpret it as, oh, accept everyone, even the bottom line. Like, even if that's not what was going forward, like, that's not a bad thing to interpret it as, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
What's that one, the Will Smith meme with Carlton? Oh, he's on the right track or whatever. I can never remember the word.
He's got the
he's got-
spirit.
He got no spirit, yeah.
Okay.
John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him. For no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward."
Okay. So one of the things I think is interesting is that it's the next section after this that's like there's going to be a bunch of like little sayings kind of all thrown up together. And I think all of those little sayings, right, they're actually lumped together with this answer that he just gave. Right? And the answer that he's kind of giving, right? And again, it's to a situation that's contrasting the situation that they just came from, right? The situation that they just came from where they couldn't cast out demons or they couldn't cast out a particular demon. And now someone who's not even following them, right? Someone who's so right. So it's bottom of the hierarchy with children, but also someone that's far outside, not following us, not united with us, right? They seem to be exhibiting the power and utilizing the power that Jesus displayed, right? And they tried to stop it. Why? Because they seem to want to centralize the power and keep the power controlled, right? Because that's what you do, right? Like if you have a movement, you have anything, you centralize the power. And what Jesus is talking about is like, no, don't centralize the power. Let the power go out. Let it do what it will. And ultimately, what's going to happen is that in the end, God's going to mediate out the rewards appropriately, right? Whoever's actually on his side will be rewarded, and whoever helps you out will get rewarded, right? He's going to be the one that takes that into account. So this is another kind of like we don't necessarily need to be like out there trying to police every single person's like theology or anything. Like we should discuss it, right? Because we want to get as right as we possibly can. But at the end of the day, if someone says that they're for Christ, believe them and let God be the judge, right? And we'll keep going.
"Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another."
Okay. Right. So like it makes sense as to why that section is sort of like sectioned off, because it's kind of rambly and all over the place. But my goal is to try and get it back to the idea of each one of these little things, each one of these little teachings, are about things that are at the bottom of the hierarchy, the bottom of life, the bottom of status. And it's Jesus teaching you about how the upside down kingdom works, about how the upside down kingdom functions, right? And so, right, we're going back to the right, the idea of the children, right? And why would this maybe be put here? Because it might be connected to that idea of we just had a thing of we're going to allow people that are outside of that are towards the margin and of what could be considered Christendom, and they're not really following properly, but we're going to allow them to continue to exist. But we need to temper that with the idea of whoever causes one of the little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck or thrown into the sea. Okay, who is that being told to? That's being told to, like, preachers and pastors, right? This is why we say things like preachers and pastors are going to be called to a higher standard. Why? Because if they are teaching people that it's okay for them to sin, well, then they are the whoever that causes one of the little ones to sin, right? And so, like, at the same time that you're allowing people to go about doing what they're doing, if they're doing this, they should know that if you're causing people to sin with whatever it is that you're doing, you're going to be judged for that. So, like, make sure that you're doing things properly. Well, now that you're on the topic of judgment, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Right? It's better for you to enter life than crippled with two hands and going into hell. Okay. I don't know, especially with the two of you here, I don't feel like this is a point that I really need to, like, hammer home, but, like, this is the clear example in scripture of, like, an area that you're not supposed to take literally, right? Like, you're supposed to understand that it's hyperbole and that Jesus is speaking in hyperbole here. And it's not the case that everyone in the church has always done that. There have been a number of people that have literally done this. And basically it's a dumb idea. It's a point. Like, the whole point of what Jesus is saying is he's drawing a distinction between, right? It's a distinction between entering life and going to hell, right? And going to hell here is going to Gehenna. So here it's Gehenna. Have I talked about that in this stuff? Have I talked to you guys about Gehenna? Do you know what Gehenna is? No? Oh, okay. Well, then I will talk about this. Okay. So, Gehenna is
James Woods is with the blue hair and Hercules. That was the voice.
I know that James Woods is the voice of
Hades. I meant in Hercules.
Hades in Hercules. Okay. Yes. Okay. I was like, what is
my E's mixed up?
I was like, what? I was like,
He was not the voice of Hercules.
Yeah,
He was definitely not.
he was the voice of Hades. Yes.
Who was the voice?
I literally think it's like Aaron Carter.
Sure.
It's something like ridiculous like that.
Ridiculous name, Aaron Carter.
Yeah. No.
It's relatively unknown.
Okay. So, have you heard of people talk about, like, the Valley of Gehenna? No. Interesting. Okay. So Gehenna is pretty much everybody agrees is literally a reference to a valley that is at the foot of Jerusalem. So if you think of Jerusalem as a hill, there's a valley at the foot of it, and that is Gehenna. You can actually find there's a YouTube video of genetically modified skeptic. I don't know. Do you know who that is? And he talks about how he like always had like this fear of hell, and so like whenever he learned that hell was actually like this valley at the foot of Jerusalem, he went and visited it, and it's just like him walking around going, "Oh, it's kind of a nice place. This is really pleasant," and like that was supposed to help him like get over his like fear of like hell. And it was like, you're an idiot. Like,
What do you want to do?
It's so stupid. Like you don't like, huh? It's like if you think that Jesus is talking about like the literal place of like the valley at the foot of Jerusalem, that's where everybody's going to go. That's stupid. It's not what he's talking about. Now, that being said, a lot of Christians understand that is a stupid way to understand it, but they come up with equally silly things that are not true that they say about it. So like, have you ever heard that like, well, I guess maybe you guys haven't because you haven't even heard about Gehenna. That it's like it was like a garbage pit where they set things on fire. Okay, well, anyways, that's one of those like Christian memes or woozles or whatever, is that that in the valley of Gehenna, it was a trash pit that they would burn all of their trash in. It was basically
fire.
Yeah, it literally dumpster fire. That's what people like say, and they're like, "Oh," and everybody in Jerusalem knew this, and so that's what people would have conjured to mind. No, there's no evidence that like was ever the case. That some like again, it's a Christian meme woozle that somebody came up with. That's not true. Like but you'll see prominent people still say that to this day. But if you do any kind of research on it, everybody's like, no, we have no evidence that this was ever the case. Now, it'll sometimes be referred to as the Valley of Hinnom, but that's just the same thing. It's the same location. Now, there is a legitimate connection between the place and fire because during the time of the Canaanites, it was the location that the Canaanites performed child sacrifices there, and specifically child sacrifices where they burned their children alive to the god Moloch. That did happen, and to me, that should be a good enough connection between it that you don't need this garbage pit thing. Like that, we do have.
But it looks okay there. Like you can actually go.
Yeah, yes, it does look okay there. It is a pretty place. There's trees and grass and stuff. But like it also should be noted that the idea of using the word Gehenna to describe hell, and it's very clear that Jesus is. I also want to make this clear because sometimes whenever you get into like traditionalist versus conditionalist debates, this has changed in recent years, but it always seems like whenever somebody on the conditional side tries to bring up this point that, well, Gehenna is just the valley at the bottom of Jerusalem, it's almost like they say that to try and be like, oh, well, that means that Gehenna is not really that bad, and so we don't really need to be that scared of hell. Well, the problem is that the tone of everything that Jesus is saying here makes it sound really bad. And also, you should understand that using the word Gehenna as a stand-in for hell is a practice that seemingly Jesus came up with. Like, we really don't have any other sources or any other records of, as far as I know, people in the Second Temple period using Gehenna as a description for like a painful afterlife. or serving as the place of hell. As far as I know, no one else does it. Jesus is the only one that does it. And so if he's the only one that does it, and in his tone in all of the places, he's like, this is a really, really bad thing. Whenever we see the word Gehenna, it's appropriate for us to go, this is a really, really bad thing, right? Like, we don't need to get too complicated or too advanced with our hermeneutics and everything to figure out that that's what that Jesus is trying to convey here, that Gehenna is a bad place, okay? So it shouldn't be used as like a safety mechanism to be like, oh, well, it just means the valley. It's like, no. And again, if you take it into like more of a symbolic realm of everything that we've been talking about, it makes sense as to why Jesus would use a valley at the foot of Jerusalem to represent hell. Why is that? Well, we kind of already know this because of the book of Revelation, but what is heaven? Heaven is a city that comes down on the new Jerusalem. It's the shining city on a hill, right? And so what's at the bottom of that? The valley where everybody that's not in this city is at, okay? And then you're going to get other references to the end time state where it talks about people being put outside of the city, right? Because it's this connected thing. If you're put outside of the city, you're put into hell, right? You're at this place that's at the bottom, it's at the outside, okay? And it's bad. You don't want to go there, okay? All right. I guess I'll also make this point because I guess you guys aren't aware of it and other people potentially aren't aware of it. That whenever this verse comes up in like conditionalist debates, conditionalist versus traditionalist debate, do you both know what the conditionalist view of hell is?
Probably didn't talk about it.
Probably
Not at all.
Okay, so the conditionalist view of hell is this. Basically, when you die, you cease to exist. That's what death means. Death means that you cease to exist. Intrinsically, you do not have an immortal soul. Okay, that's what conditionalists believe. That intrinsically you don't have an immortal soul. The only way that you can get an immortal soul is that if Jesus grants immortality to your soul. And they believe that he does this. Well, again, I'm talking about a spectrum of beliefs. So there's probably some conditionalists that would augment this a little bit. But by and large, it's this. That immortality is granted at the general resurrection. At the general resurrection, there will be a general resurrection, one a resurrection to life, and another a resurrection to death. So everybody that's dead, that ceased to exist, they'll be brought back into existence. And then at that point, they'll be granted the people that are Christians will be granted eternal life. And then everybody else will be sentenced to hell. And what they think hell is essentially a big fire. And they'll be put into that fire and they'll suffer for a period of time, but then their body will be consumed up and they'll die again. They refer to that as the second death. And then when they die again, that will be the end of them, and then they will cease to exist. They will no longer exist, and they'll never be resurrected again or anything like that. And so that's why they're sometimes called conditionalists, because they're trying to emphasize that immortality is conditional upon God. And then other times they're called annihilationists because the person that's in hell gets annihilated from existence, and so they stop existing. Whenever a conditionalist, I'm not a conditionalist, by the way, I think it's a silly idea for a number of reasons. I won't go into all of them today
I think you need to.
because we won't have time. Anyone that's watching this can either be referred to my video that's called An Asymptotic View of Hell, where I talk about it a little bit, or I will eventually write a book on this topic. That's why I'm going to school. And I hope to have a really big section on why conditionalists are wrong. At that point, I'll probably make a video on all the ways that I think conditionalists are wrong. So save it for then. What I'm trying to highlight here in this passage is that if a conditionalist were to read this, whenever they see something like the unquenchable fire, they will hammer home the point that the things that are spoken of as like lasting forever are never the person, right? So like in this case, it's the unquenchable fire. Lower down, it says, where their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched. They'll be like, oh, the human person, they don't keep living and they don't keep experiencing the suffering, so they don't believe in eternal conscious torment. That's what the traditional view of hell is, eternal conscious torment. They believe it's eternal. They don't believe it's conscious. And so because it's not conscious, it's not torment forever. It's brief torment, right? That's basically what conditionalists believe in, is brief torment. They'll make the point of like, oh, well, it's the worm that doesn't die and it's the fire that's not quenched. So the person that the worm is eating or that the fire is consuming, those things last forever, but the person doesn't. I think that's a silly idea. There's no need for an eternal worm to be eating a person if the person's just like dead. Like, why even have that descriptor? Like it doesn't do anything. But just so you know, that's how conditionalists use those passages. Any questions about any of that? Yeah, I know that's a side topic, but I just wanted to highlight it there.
We'll call it a bottom. I'm not one of those people.
I think you are, because I think you're the only one that's ever done
No, no, somewhat, some,
it. Some
not-
made up
this
person.
person, but no.
Mm-hmm. Oh man. Okay. So yeah. So I guess then the last thing that I want to talk about is this end part. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will we make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Okay. So this is a very interesting and weird transition, and seems to just be like a stream of consciousness.
Yeah,
transition.
it's a very
It's
like ADHD.
Yeah, like, oh,
here.
I'm talking about fire. Everyone's going to be salted with fire. Salt's good. Like,
But what if it's not good? So
but what if you lose its saltiness, right? In all that
It's
stuff.
very, you guys haven't watched that 70 show, right?
Yeah.
Oh, you have? Oh,
Yeah.
it's just very reminiscent of The Circle.
Yes, it is.
Very
It's just like someone has an idea, someone has a connected idea, someone has like a vaguely connected. Yes, that's kind of what it is.
All right.
But it seems to be
he's stressed. That's normal.
right. But it seems to be right, and like I said, there's this connected idea about what it's like to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, but also this connected idea of the bottom of the bottom status, and also connecting it back up with the thing that's up at the top, right? Which is about service, right? And so he's talking about proper service in his kingdom and how his kingdom works, and he's just talked about making sure that you're not going to get thrown into the outside of the kingdom and how to avoid being thrown into the outside of the kingdom. And so now he's talking about he's connecting what it's like for the people that are thrown to the outside of the kingdom with the people that are in the kingdom, right? And the connected tissue there is for everyone will be salted with fire, right? So he just talked about how the people that are sinning, the people that are not a part of the kingdom of God, they're going to be hit with fire. But also, everyone is going to be hit with fire. And so you're going to be hit with fire too, right? But he wants to emphasize that this fire that you're being hit with, that you, right, the fire that sinners are being hit with, that's to consume and destroy them, right? In whatever term that consume and destroy means, go back to debates about what I just talked about, traditionalism versus conditionalism. But there's also the understanding that when this fire hits you, you'll be salted with it, and salt is good, okay? And so this fire that you're hit with is something more like trials, okay? Something more like difficult things that you're going to have to endure. And right, we have other passages in the Gospels of Jesus talking about salt and these connected ideas. And the salt is a right everybody always talks about flavor, right? But which this is the saltiness, right, might be referring to the flavor, but really what salt was in the ancient world was a preservative. That's what it was. It was a preservative. It was a thing that it was a thing, right? Okay. Salt,
The ancient freezer.
it's an ancient freezer, but more importantly than that, salt is a thing that you get from where? The ocean,
Oh.
right? Well, or Earth, but mainly the ocean, right? You collect it, and the ocean, big bodies of water. These are elements of chaos, right? And it's outside, right? And so it's a little thing that you collect from the outside, and it does what? It preserves the thing that you eat, right? And so it's a thing from the outside that keeps the whole world together, essentially, right? And it actually is a really valuable resource, right? Especially in the Roman context. Romans actually paid their soldiers in salt. It was one of the primary ways that they got paid. So salt is a big deal, okay? And so, yes, there's the flavor thing, but it's the aspect of preserving life, right? Because this is what it's about. He's talking about entering into life, right? So I want to ask this question that Jesus asks here is, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how does salt lose its saltiness? Fundamentally, salt can't lose its saltiness. Right? That's not a thing that happens, right? If you're thinking practically, salt doesn't lose its saltiness. It just stays salt, unless something interacts with it. And the primary thing that maybe would interact with it, or that the main way that salt would lose its saltiness is if it's diluted into something else, right? If the salt is consumed, right, in your food, in water, or whatever, if the salt is consumed with a bunch of other stuff, it then loses its saltiness, right? That's how salt loses. It's not because of the salt itself, it's because it's been diluted by a bunch of other stuff. Okay. So that's how salt loses its saltiness, is that it's been diluted. How will you make yourself salty again?
Doesn't say here, so.
Well, how will you make it salty again?
kind of
Sorry.
ruined it a little bit there, but
Maybe, yeah. Okay. Well, again, I'm trying to not deviate from the text, right? So it seems obvious to me that the way that you make yourself salty again is you go back to, well, what you do is you add more salt. You add more salt. That's how you restore the saltiness. Okay, you add more, right? Because it's if it's a dilution, well, you need to add more saltiness. Well, where is the connected idea here about where the salt came from? Salt came from fire. So if you as a Christian have lost your capacity to serve, to be a preservative force in the world, if you've lost that and you are no longer operating as salt to the world, how is that restored? It's restored with fire. It's restored with trials. This is obviously true, right? Like we've talked about that even like with like right, we kind of lost the nominal Christian, like nominal Christianity has kind of died out in this country, right? And like a lot of us, most people see that as really bad, right? Now everybody will be like, well, this country lost it when we took prayer out of schools, right? And stuff like that. But it's like, okay, well, we seem to have like the Christians in America seem to have lost their saltiness. Well, how is that restored? It's restored by trials. It's restored by people going through hard times. And when people go through hard times, they will turn back to God, the person that they rely on, and that will restore the preservative element of the world. You could even kind of argue that, right? Like if we were having this conversation with like Pastor Ken, right, he'd probably be bringing up like the Asbury revival thing that's going on, right? And people be like, okay, well, why is the Asbury revival thing going on right now? And pretty much everybody's going to agree, because everything in the world sucks right now, right? It's like because it's because the Christians and everyone is being salted with fire. We're going through trials, and so as we're going through trials, Christians should be gaining saltiness and should be gaining their preservative force in the world and should be becoming more and more like Christ by serving others, right? The thing that I said above. And so when you do that, you'll have salt in yourself and be at peace with one another. Does that make sense? Right? And so I'm trying to not go like too far out of like what's in the text, but I'm trying to connect those different
I think so
ideas.
many people would have missed that. Would have missed even the opportunity to try and discover that, based on the fact that my eyes see the "for everyone will be salted." I'm reading that in like a poorly constructed English lens of he's still talking about those people that will be thrown into the fire, and he's
Right.
just kind of saying like, you're not gonna like go to hell and get away with anything. Like when you're going to hell, everyone will be salted with fire. That is not really necessarily like if someone told me like, how do you interpret this? I would have said that, but
Sure.
in my head, it's just because that just seems like something that I thought of without thinking of, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
But it makes more sense that he is trying to make something of this, because I think any half decent Christian who, you know, does some diligence in going through the Bible, has some diligence going through the Bible, will notice that, okay, Jesus says a lot of things that are really out there, but there has to be a reason for it. Like,
Yes.
they're not just in the circle.
Yeah.
It's not just Hyde, you know, taking a couple hits, talking about the car that runs on water. Like, I know he's going somewhere with this, but I think people like me who've even grown up in the church, like, we've just kind of been conditioned to accept the fact, like, yeah, this is just a thing that Jesus says. And,
Sure.
And that's okay. He just says this. You're like, oh, cool. I
Yeah.
don't really know what it means. You know, so I think that it's important that we just kind of reset our brains, because there's so much that I have missed in just my upbringing. There's
Yeah.
so much that people just kind of, like you said, you know, whatever you said a while back now, just preachers miss. You know.
Yeah. I think preacher. I think there's a lot of like, and I think this comes from, but like that aspect. I think both the aspect of like people miss this, and the aspect of like preachers assuming bad things about the disciples or whatever, or preachers just kind of assuming like various different things. They come from this idea of the Bible is just like a collection of stories. It's just a random collection of stories, and it's not one unified picture.
Right.
When we lose the idea that the Bible is a unified picture,
You lose
that's whenever you start just being like, well, whatever, like, because you don't see it as a unified picture, so you don't try to think of it as that. But we got to remember that like dude, like, somebody wrote this, right? Like somebody took the time to write this, and it doesn't read like a collection of sayings. Now, there are collections of sayings out there. We have those, right? And like we know what those look like, but that's not what the Gospels are doing. The Gospels are doing a different thing. And so like whenever you come to something that looks like that, I do think it's really important for us to be like, okay, let's take some time to analyze this and try and figure out, is it just saying something random, or is there some kind of connecting theme? And if there is a connecting theme, we should take time to figure out what that is.
Part of it is the word selection, because the word "for" to begin that new sentence.
Yeah.
Even though I see, if I'm reading this by myself and not just hearing it, I see that there's a period and it's a capital F.
Sure.
I see that it's, in a sense, a new idea. But to me, it's almost like it's just a comment. And he's saying like, blah, blah, blah about hell. For everyone will go, you know?
Well, and I don't think that that's wrong. Because again, like...
I think it kind of makes me think that, well, obviously we know that he's not going to a new idea. He's just kind of like it is.
It's a transition.
Yeah, but it's cleverly transitioned. I looked at the Message version just because I wanted to see something that I know the Message is a little too
sure.
And so it starts, verse 49 and 50 is clumped as one. It says, "Everyone's going through a refining fire sooner or later." That wording completely changes what someone like me views that ending as, because that's
yes.
Like, whoa. I'm not going to hell, but I'm going to face a fire sooner or later. And this is what it says, but you'll be well preserved, protected from the eternal flames. Be preserved as yourselves, preserve the peace. So maybe that's that second part.
But even that is like a similar idea to what I was saying. Yeah. Just
that wording initially of sooner or later, everyone's going to, you know.
Yes.
That, again, it's just the translation is sometimes it can help you, sometimes it can hurt you.
And I think the transition is also better understood if the fire from the previous verse in 48 is also still understood as trials, just the distinction of fire. But in 48, those are fires which are not quenched, trials without end.
Yeah.
So in hell, you will face a trial, face the difficulty that will never end. You will never move past the fire. But everyone will be met with the trials, will be met with some fire, but they will be salted with fire. being salted with like you don't put a never-ending amount of salt onto
You
something.
put a little bit.
You put a little bit
Yeah.
of salt onto something.
It's a smaller amount. Yes.
It's a smaller amount that has a larger effect. And so it's likely an easier transition if you view fire with the same connotation in both
Function. Yeah.
places. It's just in the previous sentence, it had an additional descriptor,
Yes.
whereas in this one, it has a very different descriptor. One is a trial without end versus a sprinkling of trials.
And it's actually important that to go back to even the conditionalist argument that I was trying to make before about why I think the conditionalist argument is stupid, is because it has that additional descriptor, right? And so it's like that additional descriptor, right, beforehand is to imply that it is an unending trial. It is an unending ordeal. And so if the ordeal is unending, you can't say that the ordeal for the person ends.
Right. Well,
Right. You have to have it, the ordeal portion of it, the same functional. It can't just be the material flame, because as soon as you get to the verse about where it's applying to everybody, the flame is a metaphor for trials, for ordeals, for things that are difficult, right? So it has this airy metaphorical meaning. So it needs to also have the airy metaphorical meaning, but with the additional qualifier that the airy metaphorical meaning doesn't end. And so if you go, oh, well, this unending fire, the metaphorical meaning of it, that it's functioning, that ends because the person gets annihilated and is eliminated, but the physical flame keeps going forever. Well, that's just stupid, right? It's like that just like is like, okay, you're now mixing your metaphors from the verse to verse, right? It's like the whole thing should be connected together and should be going together of how it's trying to apply what the words mean, because the same writer is using both words. So the same writer, whenever he says fire in the later verse to mean trials, to mean difficult times, it should also mean that in the higher verses. That should be how the author is intending those words to be used. If that makes sense. Anything else?
but as for what Diego was saying with his initial interpretation of the fire verses, I think I also have a similar thing with the salt, the first half of the salt verse, because whenever I initially view this verse, I treat it as a Jesus going, now vibe with me here, and have a hypothetical where salt can lose its saltiness over time. And when you pose it like that, it sounds like what he's saying here is like a closer to like a be born again type message. Like, okay, you've been met by a situation where you've lost a key quality over time. Maybe it's purity or innocence or something in that sense.
Okay.
So like the only way you can recover that is like, okay, your first thing was like, to recover that is impossibility on its own. Like salt that's lost its salt quality will never do that itself. So it's like you would need God to step in to achieve that.
Okay.
Again, this is all I'm saying is that's how I would first brush see it. Just because this one, the salt verse to me is like it's better, it's more veiled. Like I think a lot of people upon first hearing this message when Jesus said it would not have gotten it. Or
would not have gotten what aspect?
Well, would not have gotten the image of the salt like dilution picture that you were talking
that I'm talking about.
Yeah, they would not have gotten that at that time.
Well,
more than likely, unless there's again from we're taking on faith that this is how it would
I don't-
transpire.
now-
only lacking like tone.
so I will admit that. So I think part of what's going on here is that, and I'll agree that they would not have thought of salt in like a chemical composition thing, like how we're thinking of it. I 100% agree with that. And so I think that, but I do think that they would have come to the same conclusion, because the conclusion is a practical conclusion, right? Which is when somebody like if something loses it, if anything loses its saltiness for a person living at the time, right? And you ask them like, how will you restore the saltiness? What they're going to say is, you add more salt, right? Because that's the only option that they would have had. If something has lost its saltiness, right? If a meat has lost its saltiness, the only solution is you add more salt. And so I think that they would have come to the same conclusion. Now, they might have come to it by different means, because they would have come to it by just a practical lived experience of how you restore saltiness to something. Whereas I'm talking about it more in like well, we know this scientifically, that's the only way that you could like restore it, because that's the only way that you could take that like qualia away is via dilution. But I do think that they would have at least gotten that, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that people would have picked up on that. Okay, well, the only way you can restore or saltiness is by adding more salt. Maybe it's this is an impossible task thing, and the only way that you can do it with God, that is on theme for Mark and will come up in like a chapter or two. So it's plausible that is a contender for a possible answer. So I can't rule it out completely, but I do also think that it wouldn't be that crazy to think that that they would have figured out what I said, or that somebody would have figured out what I said.
I thought when you were like mid explanation, when you were going through your thoughts on this, I thought you were going to say because it's the salt that is losing its salt. It's not the thing
That the salt is like put in.
Yeah, it's not like the meat that's becoming unsalty. It's the salt itself. And so I thought you were going to make some connection to like, this is before I thought the fire was going to be that hell fire thing was going to come in.
Sure.
I thought you were going to say something about like where the salt came from kind of thing. It's like getting your roots, going, what's the word that Christians use, like getting back,
Go back to the source or whatever.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because then that kind of leaves it a tiny bit unsatisfactory to me to say like, oh, if salt has become less, has lost its saltiness, how can that salt itself become salty again? Well, by adding salt to that salt, like if you pick up an individual grain of salt, it's like, oh, it's salty again. Like, oh, I marked this one. This is the one that lost its.
Sure.
I mean, it's a weird, very technical analysis for me to say like I disagree, but it's not that I disagree.
And that's where it's like, okay, that's hard to know that whether or not like what I'm saying or like that is like the correct way to understand it, because you are then getting very technical in the language, and it would be hard to know if that's how people at the time would have taken that
Plus,
language.
No one's salt is not referred to by grain. It's like it's quantifiable by like size, measuring cup kind of thing. It's like I have some salt. You don't say I have a piece of salt.
Yeah.
Well, and again, part of the problem here is, like I said, that from the text that we have, there isn't like a further elaboration.
No, there's
on-
not.
on
There's
this,
not.
like, parable. So it's like we get this shot at it, which he doesn't like. He poses a question and then doesn't like answer the question response full out. He just then follows with "have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another."
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we're gonna take it that that's all we. Well, that's all we get. If you said more, man, it didn't remember the rest of it. Darn.
Yeah.
And it's because of that, like that kind of distinction of like we're not too sure on what hypothetical or what picture he's drawing here.
Yeah, and it will, and it then also becomes of the have salt in yourself. What does that mean to have salt in yourself, right? And
Right. Well, because and then it comes back to what is the salt, which you brought up the preservation idea.
and to me, it can like this is where I'm like, okay, I have to do the connected ideas. I have to follow this path that it's gone, and it seems like, well, the salt is connected with the idea of the fire, right? Like that seems to be like. Right, like it in one place it's used as a verb and now it's suddenly switched to a noun, so you have that confusion, but it does seem to be that these are like the connected things, right? So it's like the otherwise you're really just at a guess for what is the salt that you can have in yourself.
Yeah. So you're saying by going through the trials is how you restore the saltiness.
Yes, like the quality that is like of what it means to like for a Christian to have salt. That's what I'm trying to say.
It doesn't really say what the salt is, though.
It does. No, it's an ephemeral quality.
Mm.
I'm in the camp of it's an ephemeral quality that's brought about through trials.
Oh no! So that means salt is a je ne sais quoi. Oh,
Which also works.
All of the uses of salt that I'm finding.
Because literally, if you go, oh, it has a certain je ne sais quoi, they literally are probably talking about salt that's been added to the dish. I mean, literally, like you know that when somebody goes like, it needs a certain something, I don't know what it is. They're talking about salt. But I think I'm going to end the recording there.